In Europe, evil is amongst you. Europe is crumbling. Europe has failed.
So I realized these clips are quite old, but they still bug me, and I had to start somewhere with this channel. So a couple of years ago, Steven actually went to Europe. Why?
We are here actually for, we can say that now, for one of the Santorum daughters' weddings, Senator Santorum.
A representative of the media going to a politician's daughter's wedding already slightly annoys me. Even if they are personal friends, like, why is Jared there? Was he your +1?
For those wondering, Not Gay Jared is dressed as a potato.
Steven basically starts the video by saying, "The cliffs of Moor suck because it was rainy."
Because I saw it now, I have no desire to see Stonehenge, because I feel as though I'll be disappointed.
But let's get to the part that actually bugs me.
As you know, I've been concerned about going to Europe for a long time. We've had invitations.
As anyone, sensibly.
Avoiding Europe for safety concerns seems very, very dumb. But before I actually start, I will say this. Back then, terrorism was more on people's minds than it is right now. But still, this opinion is incredibly insulting and, more importantly, ridiculously inaccurate. Imagine, like, right after 9/11, someone saying something like, "Oh yeah, New York City? Fuck that. I'm not going there. It's way too unsafe. Like, the Americans, they don't have a handle on their terrorism problem. Actually, you know what? Fuck the whole country, from Fairbanks to Naples. Just unsafe for travel." Steven, can you see how a statement like that would not only be stupid, but very insulting to the American people? Well, as a European, I have to say it's insulting to me that you want to avoid a whole continent because you're scared of terrorism. But what's kind of hilarious is your destination.
So listen, we're in Ireland, and as you know, I've been concerned about going to Europe for a long time. We've had invitations.
As anyone, sensibly.
But Ireland was one of the few places we've talked about that we said, okay, it's pretty safe. Ireland.
Being terrified of terrorism, and then going to Ireland of all places. Like, the irony in that is just beautiful. I mean, I do of course realize that Steven was in Ireland, not Northern Ireland, and that the IRA isn't currently a problem. But dude, you have to acknowledge the irony. I mean, even Steven does.
We said, okay, it's pretty safe. Ireland obviously is not necessarily, wasn't for a long time a hotbed for any kind of terrorism.
It seems to be often forgotten that Europe has a long history of terrorism. For instance, when it comes to my home country, Germany, Ansbach wasn't the first terrorist bombing, and it certainly wasn't the deadliest. In 1980, for instance, there was a suicide bomber at the Oktoberfest, a right-wing extremist. 12 people were killed and 213 injured. For comparison's sake, in the 2016 Berlin Weihnachtsmarkt attack, 12 people were killed and 48 injured. But what's the bigger picture? Let's take a look at an actual terrorism hotspot and see if data helps us answer a few important questions. First question, was Europe recently worse at handling terrorism than the United States? The answer to this one is no. Terrorist attacks are sporadic, and we have to think in decades, so any fair comparison would need to include 9/11, and on that day alone, 3,000 people were killed and more than 6,000 were injured. Since the year 2000, in all of Europe, and that's including Istanbul, there were 738 deaths and about 5,439 injuries as a result from Islamic terrorism. Now I know what you might be saying. It's unfair comparing 9/11 to European terrorism. But no, it's not. Steven actually does exactly that in the episode from the clips I showed you at the start. But his comparison, I would argue, is absurd. The video I'm talking about is from 2017. Episode 141, Multiculturalism Has Failed, where Sargon made a guest appearance. And I have to say, Sargon never seemed so reasonable to me. Anyway, the episode was recorded just after the Westminster Bridge attack, where 5 people were killed and 50 were injured. 11 minutes into the episode, he shows a clip of Giuliani right after 9/11, and he compares that to Sadiq Khan's reaction after the bridge attack.
When I say a giant pussy, what I mean is that I believe the mayor of London, Stephen, is a full-blown faggot.
So it turns out that a coordinated attack where 2 airliners are flown into the World Trade Center and another airplane is flown into the Pentagon, and yet another plane fails to reach Washington, D.C., turns out that kind of attack warrants a different response than a car attack where 5 people were killed. I mean, who could have known that?
By the way, this show isn't balanced. I'm horribly biased, okay? I let you know that, and then you can challenge me on it.
Second question, is terrorism in Europe at a historic high? No, not even close. These graphs paint a very clear picture, but I'll add a couple of numbers on top. In the UK, in the 70s, there were 1,769 deaths from terrorism. In the 80s, 1,111 deaths. In the 90s, 425 deaths from terrorism. But in all of the 2000s up to 2017, almost 2 decades, there have been 135 deaths from terrorism in the UK. So in the UK, terrorism has diminished dramatically. What about Germany? Well, in the 60s and 70s, there were 27 deaths from terrorism. In the 80s and 90s, 41 deaths. And in the 2000s, up to date, there were 26 deaths from terrorism. So again, no increase. To be fair, in France, the picture is very different. In the 20th century, there were very few deaths from terrorism there. But since 2000, France has seen many of the deadliest attacks on European soil. So what can we conclude from this? Well, looking at the Wikipedia article, Terrorism in Europe, which contains a color-coded list of the deadliest events, we can clearly see that there has been a shift from mainly left-wing terrorism up to World War II, to mainly separatist with some right-wing terrorism up to the 90s, and nowadays the deadliest attacks are almost exclusively Islamist. So in Western Europe as a whole, there was no increase in deaths related to terrorism. Quite the opposite. In the UK, dramatically so in fact. But again, there has been a shift in the motivation of the perpetrators. Terrorism is not only decreasing in Europe, by the way, but worldwide. And I don't want to diminish the importance of terrorism, I just want to contextualize it. Certainly more rationally than Stephen does.
In Europe, evil is amongst you. Europe is crumbling, Europe has failed.
Again, these remarks were made just after a terrorist attack in Europe had taken place. Even if he was right, would that be the time and way to say it? There's a lot I like about Americans, but their arrogance is not one of those things. And Stephen in particular epitomizes this high and mighty American attitude towards Europe. To be fair though, it also happens the other way around. But onto the third and last question. Just for curiosity's sake, how does Islamic terrorism in Europe compare to mass shootings in the US? Well, they compare like gloves. I only included events with 4 or more deaths, not including the perps, and since 2000 there were over 731 victims of mass shootings in the US. Again, in the whole of Europe, which has a bigger population, there were 738 deaths from Islamic terrorism in the same time period. And again, that's including Istanbul. So what's my main point? Well, it's very simple. Don't avoid a whole continent because of something you saw on the news. You don't need to avoid all of South America because of Zika, or all of the US because of guns and Trump. If, on the other hand, your government advises against traveling to a certain country, sure, take that into account, rationally. And please be smart about your destination and company. But if you don't feel like biking through Afghanistan, and like Stephen, you have a phobia of homicide when on holiday, Western Europe is statistically, without a doubt, one of the safest destinations on Earth and way safer than the United States. In fact, if you're making your decision based on homicide rates alone, Japan seems like your dream destination, Stephen. But even there, you won't be 100% safe from terrorism.
Well, that's racist. We don't accept racism on this show. Only sexism and blatant homophobia, Sargon. Read the handbook.
No, can't win with Crowder, can you?
No. I know it's silly and I make fun of Europe because, you know, soccer and man buns and you're a little bit effeminate, but our heart goes out to our European brethren.